Today on Pilot's Discretion, we're joined by tail dragger expert and writer Martha Lunken. She talks about the good old days of aviation, lessons learned from thousands of check rides, and flying the Lockheed Lodestar. Pilot's Discretion starts right now. Welcome, pilots. I'm John Zimmerman, and thanks for listening to Pilot's Discretion from Sporties. Visit sporties.com/podcast for today's show links and access to our archives, where you can listen to every episode. Also, we'll be releasing our 100th episode soon, and we'd love to hear your comments or questions. Send us an email at podcast@sporties.com, and we'll answer some listener questions on that show. Today, I'm joined in the studio by an aviation legend, Martha Lunken. She's had many jobs over her long career, including stewardess, flight school owner, FA instructor, inspector, pilot examiner, and even Sporties employee at one point. And for many years, she specialized in giving check rides in large tail draggers like the DC-3. She is best known for her writing, probably, which has appeared in Flying Magazine for over a decade. And I would be remiss if I did not mention that she has published a great book featuring some of her most popular columns. Unusual Attitudes, Obsessions, and Confessions of a Lady Pilot is available from where else? Sporties. Martha, welcome to Pilot's Discretion.
Thank you, John. It's good to be here.
I know you and I could probably talk for 3 hours today about all kinds of things, so I'm going to pick my questions carefully. And I want to start with a broad view of aviation as you've seen it. You've seen a lot throughout your career, and it would be easy to talk about all the things that have changed, and I'm sure we'll get there. But let's start with what has not changed. Are there things that are the same, parts of being a pilot or parts of the aviation industry that really have endured over the 6 decades you've been around airplanes?
You know, there are, and I think maybe you'll see this more clearly away from big cities. I mean, there are lots of young people and older people who are learning to fly in Cubs and 152s and 172s at airports out in the country. And it's pretty much the same as it used to be. Where I see a great change is in these flying schools at large airports like Lunken or Dayton or Greater Cincinnati or you name it, where there are programs where these usually young people are told, you know, if you give us the money and we'll arrange the loan, we can get you through this entire course in 8 months, and you'll be a flight instructor, and then you can start instructing and pay some of this back. I don't like that. I don't think that attracts the right people. I don't think it works too well. I've been told the dropout rate in those kinds of programs is 80%. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know, but it's probably considerable. And the other thing is, in the push by the airlines to hire pilots and to sell aviation, this business of convincing women that they need to get in there. They need to, I think there's something like between 5 and 10% of the actual pilot population is women. I'm a living example of somebody who's crazy about airplanes and always has been. What I see more often is women who are, how can I say it, except trying to prove something. And generally that doesn't work over time. You know, they might do well going in, but they don't last. I've flown with some wonderful women pilots. I remember coming back, I was en routing back from the West Coast on, I guess, Delta, and the woman in the left seat was not only beautiful, she was extremely competent, she was a lawyer, and she had a family, and I thought, boy, I feel like a dunce. But so I'm not saying women shouldn't fly. They should, but they should want to.
Yeah, has there been something lost in the drive, as you mentioned, for the career-based flying and the flight training? There's the other side of general aviation that it's about enthusiasts or maybe personal travel.
Right.
Something you write about so well is the people in aviation. You have this great quote from your book that stories would be like faded black and white images without the people who sharpen and color them, which is, I think, true of anything in life,
Yes.
but particularly true in aviation, an industry that just seems to be filled with colorful characters, some good, some bad, but most of them memorable. Why do you think airplanes attract such unique people?
Well, first of all, I have to say that I had a friend years ago, and there was some truth in what he said. Said every crook ends up at the airport sooner or later. But no, it's a great leveler. Even today, you get doctors and lawyers and kids kind of off the street who are trying to scrape together enough money, or looking for a scholarship. It's a big mix of people, but it's also a leveler because nobody cares really how much money you have or how much education. You're all in it together. When I learned to fly, in our group there was Dennis Walter and Bill Murphy, and Hal Shevers was the manager of the little flying school. I don't know, there were 7 or 8 of us, and we were all vastly different backgrounds, but we had that in common, and we bonded. We were friends because of it. I don't see that happening today. I see kids or young people walking into a flight school and having to push a buzzer in order for them to open the gate, and then come in, meet their instructor, go into a briefing room, brief, go out in the airplane, fly, come back in the briefing room, buzz themselves out of the gate, and there's no social commitment. There's no social atmosphere to that. I'm not sure I would have gone ahead with it if it had been that way. Maybe, but I don't know. On the other hand, the instructors in these schools are usually very, very good. Most of the time. I asked an instructor up at, he was at Dayton. It was one of the big flight schools that had a operation at Dayton. And this young kid was really happy because he was just about to get his instructor's rating and start instructing. And, of course, these schools are all on specialized programs. They don't follow the normal Part 61 time requirements. And I said to him, how much time do you have alone in an airplane? And he said, well, with my instructor, and then with the simulator, and I said, no, I mean absolutely by yourself in an airplane. And I think he came up with 7 or 8 hours. And I thought, no.
It's a different feeling by yourself.
Yeah.
It really is.
You need that feeling.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the glories of aviation, that it puts you are in command of your fate. And my sister, I don't think you know her, but she's very shy. And when we learned to fly in an old crummy air coupe, she thought it was the greatest thing in the world on her solo flight. And when it was my turn, I was scared to death. And the instructor made us keep the canopy open, even though it was February, because, if you crash, you can get out more easily. And I was singing at the top of my lungs around the traffic pattern. But it's interesting what it does for you, and the confidence in yourself and the willingness to keep going. Yeah, learn more. There wasn't as much to learn then. Yeah.
I couldn't agree more on both the way our airports look. I once wrote an article on Airfax titled "Our Airports Look Like Prisons," and I think I got more glowing emails and comments on that than anything else, and that has definitely hurt the community. But you're 100% right on the leveling, and I always explain that to people new to aviation, that my version of this was at Oshkosh, fairly young, maybe 17. I think I was a new private pilot, and I was standing on the flight line just watching the afternoon air show, and I got to talking to two guys next to me, and I had no idea who either one of them was. But it turned out that one of them was an extremely high-time air show pilot and had flown everything, one of these people who had done it all and flown everything, military, airline, air show. And the other was the CEO of a aerospace company that we would all recognize. And I didn't know that until we'd been talking airplanes for 15 minutes. And just, it's to your point that it's about airplanes, and it does have a way of connecting people that doesn't happen much any other place anymore.
No.
So the ultimate example of that is somebody you wrote about in flying and in your book, which is Neil Armstrong, a name that every American knows. You, I know, had the privilege of meeting him and knowing him. I've had the privilege of meeting him once or twice throughout since he lived here in Cincinnati. I think what struck both of us, I know it struck me, was how humble and quiet he was. Not the stereotypical, test pilot strutting through the pilot's lounge. Not at all. And humble is not a word we typically associate with pilots.
But it is with engineers. Right.
So is that what it is? How did Neil, of all people, stay humble? Is it just the engineering professor mindset?
I truly believe so, yeah. Who was the guy who flew with him on the moon mission?
Buzz Aldrin?
Buzz. Buzz is totally different. But I met Neil Armstrong because he was speaking at the Aviation Hall of Fame at Dayton. And my husband and I were up there, and the sponsor of that was Harry Combs, and he knew Neil Armstrong very well. So one afternoon before the ceremony, Abby and me and Harry Combs and his wife and Neil and his wife went driving around Dayton, and actually, it's almost spooky when I think of it. We visited the Wright brothers' home, which was a beautiful sort of mansion. And, of course, one of them didn't get to live in it very long, but they each had an entrance, exactly the same, on opposite ends of the house. And this caretaker, one of the big Dayton companies owned it. He took us through and showed us all the little gadgets they had, like the showers with things coming in from all different angles, and a book chair with a thing where you could adjust the book, and just a lot of stuff. And we came down the stairs, and it was a December afternoon, late in the afternoon. It was getting dark, and I was standing still on the steps, and Neil and his wife were down below. And I said, I cannot believe I'm standing in the same place as the first man to walk on the moon, in the house of the first guy to fly off the face of the earth. I mean, that was a real, that was a good one. But he was a very nice man. As we were driving, he was driving, and he hit a dog on a farm road. I think we were looking for a place to have lunch. And he stopped the car, got out, went up to the farmer, tried to, but the dog had run out. There was no, and then when we found a restaurant, and the waitress said to him, "What you want, sugar?" And I thought, "Old lady, if you only knew who this was." But he was, he was very humble. He asked me if I would teach his wife to fly, his second wife. And Carol, and I tried. Oh, Lord, I tried. She was constantly getting airsick. And I even baked ginger cookies and said, to eat some of these. And after, 5 or 6 sessions, I said, let me send you to somebody else. And I was thinking of Al Pacell, because he could teach anybody to fly. And she said, you know what? I really don't want to learn to fly. And I said, well, why don't you talk it over with Neil and then decide. She said it's just that all his friends fly, and he, wanted me to, but they evidently worked that out. But, I think you can teach almost anybody to fly, almost. But she didn't want to, and she didn't belong in that.
So someone I think you wouldn't compare to Neil Armstrong, if we want to go the other way, would be Warbird pilots. And we may be picking at one here, but one of your most memorable columns in flying that you probably got a fair amount of mail over was the one you wrote about Warbird pilots. So I'm going to quote from that so I don't get your words wrong. You describe them as, quote, those self-canonized, steely-eyed, sweaty, flight-suited with just enough chest hair visible Warbirdians, those swashbuckling, swaggering knights of the air. So tell me about your thoughts on Warbird pilots.
I have flown AT-6s, and which isn't like flying a P-51, but it's close to it from the back seat. And I've flown DC-3s, I've flown Lockheed 18s, I've flown Twin Beaches. So these guys are flying whatever, and most of them were never in the military. They didn't learn to fly these airplanes in the military. But they're playing dress-ups. You know, they always used to say to me, even when I was in the 180 or a Cub, why aren't you wearing fireproof flight suit and gloves? I said, if this thing crashes, you know, it's no different than if you crash and catch on fire. Why are you wearing them? They're playing a game, and I feel they kind of bask in the adoration of the little guy pilot, and I hate that.
Do you think it's changing at all in the Warbird community as the years have gone on? I mean, we've lost basically all the World War II vets now.
Yeah, I think so.
And there's been some turnover. What's changed in that community over the last few decades?
Well, you know, I'm not close enough to them to really know what changes they've made. When Todd Weinmiller and in that group was flying, I have a funny story about that. They were doing a flyover on a funeral over the cemetery. And Jim Stitt was flying the lead in his T-28, and Todd Weinmiller and another guy, and their fourth guy flying the tail didn't show up. So I had the T-6, and they said, would you fly? I said, but I'm not qualified in formation. But, it's all right, just fit yourself in. I said, okay, fine. And it was great, except that right over the cemetery, Jim turned on his smoke, and I was totally IFR. So I just held everything the way it was. They practiced so much formation flying, and they had fun. But it's also something that was pretty much relegated to people with some money, because keeping fuel in those things is. I had a friend who wanted his airplane exercised, and we worked a little deal where I exercised his airplane and he helped with the fuel.
That seems like a good trade to me.
It was great.
Well, lots of pilots, when we start talking about T6s and DC-3s, you get into these conversations about old school skills or some version of that.
Yeah.
And some pilots bemoan the loss of these skills, and I've been known to do that myself. Let's define what we're talking about there. What are the skills that you needed to learn to fly a DC-3 or even something smaller than that? A Cessna 180, right?
Yeah, the 180 is a great example.
What do you need to learn there that is still valuable today versus just trivia? What is still important that maybe we're losing?
I have to say, I checked your dad out in a 180. I had never been in one in my life. But I had been in a lot of tailwheel airplanes. And I'm not sure it's fair to talk about a 180, because that could be kind of squirrely, But even talk about a 182 but the basic skills of stick and rudder, handling coordinated turns, maintaining altitude, precision flying, leveling off, descending, leveling off, even ground reference maneuvers, becoming really kind of at one with the airplane and feeling what was out of whack. I used to fly occasionally with Red Stewart up at Waynesville, and Red would sit in the front seat. Usually this kind of Red ran off into a cornfield with somebody, so I was up there giving him a check. And I'd sit in the back seat and say, "Okay, Red, tell me how to make a bank turn." And he'd put his hands down and he'd squeeze the toes of your shoes when he wanted you to add a little rudder pressure until you could feel it. And precision was, but the airplane manufacturers kind of manufactured that out of the airplanes. So you can fly a Cherokee or a Colt or almost anything, little airplane, and not know a thing about. But where it gets people is on crosswind landings. Mm-hmm. And many a flight check I've given where I've said, okay, the flight check's over. Now I'm going to teach you to do crosswind landings. And we'd go someplace like Hamilton where it was, a built-in crosswind. And that's something that needs to be practiced and practiced and practiced. And it shows a good command of the airplane.
And how do I get that? If I'm a newer pilot and I sense that I haven't fully learned that, is it just experience? Do I need to find the right instructor?
Find an instructor.
Do I need to fly a tailwheel airplane, or can I do it in a 172 with the right instructor?
172, anything, yeah. Because it doesn't change. Mm-hmm. The fact of getting it on the ground. In the tailwheel, it becomes a little more of a game once you're on the ground. But, people really don't, and you would believe, but the number of people who have fender benders in airplanes on crosswind landings and say, "I don't know what happened. Mm-hmm. I just don't know what happened." The other one is holding it off. I mean, if you own a flight school, you know how many nose wheels get knocked sideways. And it's almost like with a lot of people, as long as I can get it on the ground, going fairly straight, that's okay. Well, no, it isn't. That's not the art of flying, and I think that's really what I'm trying to say: the art of flying. Now, when it comes to, as we'll probably talk about, when it comes to mastering all the new electronics in an airplane, that's a different story. But I did hear a guy who flies for the airlines say a couple weeks ago, "I would rather lose an engine on takeoff than lose my
primary flight display." Yeah.
And I thought, oh, wow.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I believe that.
I believe it too.
I believe that. But there's something, it's not just about safety there's something fun about mastering the airplane, I find. And I can remember an early instructor who showed me how to level off. You mentioned that. I thought, well, come on, I got an instrument rating. I know how to fly this airplane. He said, you have no idea how to level off the airplane. What do you mean? And he proceeded to show me the right way to do it.
Yep.
It's just fun. In addition to making you safer, I think it makes it more rewarding.
Fun. It's precision and it's fun and
And sometimes it's just knowing what to pay attention to. I find that it's hard to fix it if you don't notice it. And so a lot of the best instructors, the most important thing they do is they show you what to pay attention to. And a lot of times they don't even have to tell you to fix it or how to fix it. It's just a matter of knowing, oh, wow, I never noticed that I was doing that, or I never noticed there was a better way to do it. So it's attention to detail.
If it doesn't take up too much time, I have to tell you a funny story about that. I was teaching a friend's wife to fly in a Cub. And we had been through all the air work out in the pattern, but we're flying downwind in the summertime at Lunken, and she's mushing downwind with the nose up in the air. Well, we had a gadget rigged up where I had a cone that went back to it was off of an airliner, a headset that she wore. And I could talk to her, but she couldn't talk to me, which was good because she... And we had a Bayside radio, which was the size of a microwave oven on the back. And I had the microphone for the Bayside. So I'm talking to her, and I have the microphone. And I said, Martha, put the nose down in level flight. And she couldn't respond, but the nose didn't go down. So I said, Martha, look out at the wingtips and put the airplane in level flight. And finally I said, goddamn, put the nose down and fly level. And I look, and I'm talking into the microphone to the tower.
Yeah, some technology is good. Headsets and intercoms may be okay for flight instruction.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about tail draggers, and I have 2% of the tail dragger time you have, if that, but I love flying tail draggers, and particularly I love flying tail draggers on grass runways.
Grass strips. That's where they're meant to be.
It's where they're at home. It's where it feels natural. It's, to me, one of the most enjoyable things you can do in an airplane is a tail dragger on a grass strip. We're lucky around here. We've got a lot we can frequent. But I suspect a lot of our listeners to this podcast have never taken an airplane onto a grass runway, probably the majority.
A lot of the flight schools don't allow their airplanes to be taken into grass strips. I don't know what to say about that. If there's any doubt, I think you might check with the airport. But around here, I don't think there's any airplane I've ever owned or flown. And the first one that I can think of was a UPF-7. And a buddy of mine said, oh, go fly it. And the first thing I did was take it up to Mad River, which had a beautiful, wide, smooth grass, and shoot some landings up there until I figured I had it done. And then I promptly took out a taxiway light when I got to London.
No, I think your first 10 or 15 landings in a new tail dragger should always be on grass. Otherwise, you're just making it far too hard on yourself.
It is. It's much different. Yeah, much different.
So if I'm flying one of those tail draggers, there's a little bit of lore about tail draggers, not quite to the Warbird extent, but there's a little bit of lore about, real pilots have a tail wheel and all that. And I'll go in for a little bit of that, but maybe not all the way.
Yeah.
What is it you really learn when you fly tail draggers? Everybody says it makes you a better pilot, and I would agree. But what is it? Is it just pushing the rudders? Is it that feel and precision? What makes you a better stick and rudder pilot?
I don't think there's any difference in the air. Turns and climbs and dives and whatever are the same. But as you line up with the runway, whether there's a straight ahead wind or whether it's a crosswind, you really learn to keep the airplane straight on the runway with rudder pressure and aileron position. And you've got to work at it. I always tell people at first, everybody wants to treat the rudder in a tail dragger like they do on a conventional airplane, and that's push the rudder until the airplane turns. Well, you don't do that. You treat the rudder in a tail wheel like a teeter-totter, back and forth. You're always working. You never push one way without coming back in the other way, and that takes a little practice to do.
Yeah.
And once they get it, it's great. It's great fun. It's great fun.
Yeah, my two wishes for every pilot, and certainly this is something I'm still working on after 30 years of flying, but precise airspeed control on final and not being afraid to move the controls when you're into the flare and actually touching down. Because if you are a passenger and not pilot in command, and you're +8 knots on final, and then you're a little bit unsure about actually moving the controls, that's where I see so many of those crosswind landings go badly. Certainly in a tail dragger, you're not going to get away with it. Even in a tricycle gear airplane, you may ding something. So.
May or may not, yeah. It's a challenge, and depending on the airplane, it can be more or less of a challenge. The 180's famous for wanting to swap ends on you, and please God, I never have yet. But you're always watching for it. You're always watching for it. Yeah, it's it's a very, at the end of a flight, I hope everybody does this, but at the end of a flight, I'll be sitting in front of the hangar and I'll say, that was perfect. Well, no, that wasn't perfect.
Mm-hmm.
Look at where the prop control is. And I didn't push the prop in all the way before the landing. So it always is a challenge. And as you get into it, there's always more airplanes to fly, different kinds of airplanes to fly. If you like, I miss not flying the airplanes that are equipped with sophisticated electronic devices. I have a Garmin 430 in the 180 and 4-flight, and it'll do anything you make it do, but with no autopilot on an approach, that can be really busy,
mm-hmm.
and it takes a lot of practice. So, I envy people who have. I would give a lot for an autopilot.
Martha, let's take a quick break, and we'll be back with some more questions. Hi, listeners. I wanted to share some exciting news. Sporty's has recently acquired Pilot Workshops, a company well known throughout the aviation industry for its engaging, scenario-based training programs. Don't worry, the team at Pilot Workshops isn't going anywhere, and both their products and their prices are staying the same. But you can look forward to some exciting collaboration in the future. Our goal is to make flying safer, easier, and more fun. In between Sporty's and Pilot Workshops, we now offer online training courses for every step of your aviation journey, from private pilot to IFR proficiency. If you want to learn more about Pilot Workshops or check out some of their fantastic training materials, sign up for their Pilot's Tip of the Week. This free email delivers fun and insightful tips every Wednesday, and you can read it in 2 minutes or less. Visit pilotworkshops.com to sign up. That's pilotworkshops.com. Now, back to my conversation with Martha Lunken. We are back with Martha Lunken, who often shares some of the mistakes she has made and, more importantly, the lessons learned from those experiences. So, Martha, I wanted to hit on a few of those lessons because I think they're so valuable. And I want to start with engine failures because you've experienced over a dozen engine failures in DC-3s, as you wrote about. That's a lot. What did you learn from those, and how should I react if I'm out in an Aztec or a 310 and one of them decides to pack it in?
Max power, flaps up, positive rate, gear up.
Works in any airplane, huh?
It works in any airplane. But I would add to that, max power, fly the airplane. Flaps up, fly the airplane. Positive rate, gear up, fly the airplane. Because you can get so involved in those other important things that you forget to fly the airplane. Only once have I had an engine failure in a light airplane, but in that DC-3, and you've got to remember these were freight guys I was flying with, and they were not flying all the best equipment. And so these engines are, they're I don't know what the word is, delicate, but they need a lot of tender, loving care. The one outfit that I flew a lot with, which was Miami Valley Aviation or Hogan Air, never had a problem with the engines. But the guys from Detroit or from over in Columbus, Indiana, yeah, we had a lot of them. And they would monitor there's an interesting thing about good freight pilots. As soon as they saw an oil temperature raise and a pressure start to drop, they'd feather it right now and get it back home. A private owner, and Ohio University has a DC-3, and the person who flew this is long gone. But I remember he told me that they lost an engine over, I don't know, Parkersburg, but he hoped he could get a little power out of it if he kept it running. And I thought, ooh, you just bought yourself a new engine. Mm-hmm. But, if that saved your life, okay. And the single engine performance, now, we weren't loaded down to the, max gross weight on those. One of the funniest stories was there was a state of Ohio DC-3 that had been given to the Air Force Museum in Dayton. And the head of the Air Force Museum was the father of a friend of mine, Colonel Armstrong. And he called his son Kevin and said, Kevin, who was chief pilot for Miami Valley Airways and now just retired from Coletta, can you get this thing out of here? We've got a trade going on. We've got one DC-3. We don't need two. So Kevin said, we can take off from right field, which nobody can take off from. Do you want to do it? I said, yeah. So we went up there, and we spent a whole morning while they tinkered with this engine. And we got out on the runway, and there was a line of people, politicians and Air Force people, and we go roaring down the runway. And I went down to get the gear, and I said, Kevin, because the pressure was going. He said, ooh. So he feathered it. And I said, we can come right around back in and land. He said, if we do that, we'll never get this out of here. So we flew it on down to Middletown, and, they took care of the problem. But, they were notorious for not. I gave a couple of flight checks in DC-3s where the engines failed during the ride. And if the guy handled it properly, I gave him his rating. That's otherwise, flying a DC-3, as someone so well said, is like dancing with your great aunt. You just kind of push it around the sky.
That's a great way to say it. Well, you mentioned some of those check rides, and you've given probably thousands of check rides.
I think so.
Countless. Taking your fair share, too. So what do you learn as an examiner? Are there any, deep truths about humanity, or at least tips for new pilots? Looking back on all those check rides, what do you take away from those?
Well, I've heard people say you can tell in the first 10 minutes, whether or not this person's going to pass. I don't quite agree with that. If he did reasonably well on the oral, they're all scared. They're all nervous about it. And I would do my best to even say, let's have some fun on this. And, we'd go do the maneuvers we had to do, and you couldn't let somebody repeat a maneuver if it was really done badly. That I would like to have, but you can't do that. But you can let a guy take his time, think about what he's going to do, and just provide a kind of warm atmosphere in the cockpit. I've flown with examiners who were, you knew this guy was going to flunk you from the beginning. And I have flown with guys who maybe flunked a check ride before, and then they came back and they did it again. And I'd say, before you finish this, how do you feel? You don't feel so good, do you? No, I don't. I said, we'll end the check ride here and land, because of a medical. No, not often. You didn't do that often. But if somebody fails something twice, that's a horrible burden on your shoulders. And you wanted everybody. I wanted everybody to pass, but I had no problem. One of them that was really interesting was a guy who came to Jay's flight school, and he wanted to learn in the Cirrus, and he was very, very wealthy, and he was a Palestinian. And they had no luck with him at all. And he was up to maybe 30 hours. And I said, let me fly with him. And, because it was worse. It was worse. And I finally realized it was a cultural thing. He was not about to take lessons from a woman. And I understood that, So I said, just take me home. There are all kinds of of personalities. There are people who learn to fly because their mother and father want them to. I had one years ago who said, it was when I first opened my flight school, and he said, his mother and dad came with him. They said, we want Jamie to get some sense of self-worth and come out of himself. And I said, I think you ought to take him to a different flying school. I'm not a psychologist or a psychiatrist. That's not what this is all about.
So a few years ago, you got to be on the other side of this. You took an instrument rating check ride, which you wrote about, and how challenging that was. You mentioned the avionics, mastering all that. What was that like, going back and knocking the rust off the instrument skills on that check ride?
Oh, it was brutal. It was brutal because, all I essentially knew how to do with the Garmin 430 was say direct to and go there. And then with the ForeFlight, and the thing mounted on the side of the window, and like I said, no autopilot, and the route that we would take was between 3 airports, which were very close together. So you were just, with misses, and you're in holding patterns, and then you're trying to tune up the ATIS for the next airport, and meanwhile the airplane's going to hell. So it took, I just say to myself, don't give up. And finally it all came together.
Don't give up's great advice. And I sometimes think the instrument training profile is harder than the real thing when you're doing approach after approach after approach at different airports. If you're doing it in the real world, you've got 10 minutes in cruise to brief the approach, load the avionics. It's a different story.
Absolutely. Yeah.
All right, Martha, we always end Pilot's Discretion with a lightning round we call Ready to Copy. So
okay.
I'll ask some questions on a variety of topics here, and you read back with your quick answer.
Do I like bridges? Yes.
Are you ready to copy?
Ready to copy.
Is aviation safer than it was 40 years ago?
Yes.
Is it less fun?
Yes.
Are those two things related?
Yes.
Do they have to be related?
No.
All right, this is the one I've been looking forward to most. I have occasionally asked guests on this show what they would do if they were FAA administrator for a day. I cannot wait to hear your answer. What would be the top of your list if you get installed on Independence Avenue?
I would, now I can only speak to flight standards. I would clean out the offices. I would keep people in there who had the training and the background to be good inspectors and willing to work, and get rid of all the dead wood. And there's a lot of dead wood. And I can't think of anything else. The pay is good, the benefits are great, but there's far too much unnecessary paperwork. You would not believe what it takes. If a guy collapses the nose wheel on his airplane, and the reports and the coded programs that you have to enter all this information in, I think when the FAA closed the safety program as it was and put me back in operations, that's when I retired. I simply couldn't. Because frankly, what I had to do beforehand, you'd sort of look at everybody else and see what they were doing, and you'd put in the same thing. And I knew they were doing the same thing, and I knew it was garbage. It wasn't proving anything. So I think you could streamline the FAA with good people and benefit safety tremendously.
You mentioned you've flown not just DC-3, but Lockheed's, lots of big
tailwheel
twins.
Sweet.
What's the biggest difference between a Lockheed and a DC-3?
Lockheed's harder to fly. It's a little squirrelier, but you feel like Howard Hughes in the front seat of Lockheed. And ours was a single pilot Lodestar, which is very rare. And I used to fly it occasionally, single pilot. I remember an afternoon I was down at the airport and the Lockheed was up on the ramp, and I was having a dinner party and I needed some groceries, and I thought, this is a perfect occasion. So you could still drive out. I drove out on the ramp, got in the Lodestar, fired it up, flew to Hamilton, borrowed the airport car, went to Jungle Gyms, came back with bags and bags of groceries, brought the car up and took them out of the Lockheed. And one of the guys, half drunk, came out of the Sky Galleon's restaurant and said, I can't believe this. You go grocery shopping in that thing?
That may be the most Martha Lunken story ever. That's great.
It was, and it was, I didn't plan it that way. The single thing I worried most about in that Lockheed was it had, for such a big airplane, it had a silly little elevator trim down on the console, instead of a wheel and if I trimmed it up to be able to land it alone with enough nose-up trim, if I ever had to go around, I think it would have pitched up and stalled. So whoever was in it with me, including my sister who doesn't fly anymore, I would say, what's the first thing you're going to do if I yell? Go. She said, I'm going to unscrew that because it's a very heavy airplane, as you saw the power off. So you need a lot of trim. But boy, that could be lethal. But you felt like the 30s and Howard Hughes, and it was just great. And I don't know if we have time, you can cut this if not, but when I got my type rating in, and it was in Florida with Bill Conrad at Fort Lauderdale, and I also did the multi-engine ATP. I had a single ATP. So we flew for 3 days, and he said, you're okay to go. And Ebby was up at Fernandina Beach playing golf with some of his friends. And he said, well, I'll come down on United or whatever, and then we'll fly it back here. And I said, well, there's no reason to. I'll fly it up, And he said, well, okay, the weather's good. My biggest fear with that was to be able to start it without backfiring it when there were people around, So I wanted to get out there real early, and I sat in the cockpit and needle pointed because Jacksonville was, as usual, way down. Well, as soon as it came up, I got them started, and I flew up to the beach, up to the coast, and buzzed the golf course, and then I came around to land at Fernandina Beach Airport, and I remember thinking, oh, what a wonderful thing when I get out of this airplane alone. They're going to say, wow. There was not one soul on that airport. But
so much for your grand
life
plan.
is good.
So the opposite end of the spectrum, Pietenpol.
Yeah.
Describe flying one of those for somebody who's never been in one.
Oh, just be willing to move your hands and feet a whole lot. There's no trim on a Pietenpol. And it's not dangerous, but it's just you're constantly working to keep it straight and level. And it's also very uncomfortable, the wooden seats. Maybe some of the newer ones that have been built, but this one was built by Bernard Pietenpol. And it didn't have the Model A Ford engine on it. It had a Lycoming. But yeah, it was not a long, although we did fly it to Ottumwa, Iowa, which I would never do again.
All right, I know you participated in many accident investigations throughout your FAA career, probably not your favorite part of the job. But from your perspective as an insider, or formerly as an insider there, there's this boom in accident analysis videos all over the internet. Do you think that's good or bad?
No, it's bad. And I'm thinking particularly of Dan Grider, people like that. They know no more about that the circumstances and the causes. I've been to enough accident investigation schools, both with the FAA and the Transportation Safety Institute, to know that extent that they go into the examination of the wreckage. And I don't think it's anybody's business to come up with a probable cause. Sometimes it looks pretty simple, but I think you ought to give it time and let it. It's an interesting thing. 2 of the accidents I was on the scene to investigate were men I was very close to, and you'd think, well, you can't do that. You can, because it's like a I don't know, a veil comes over. It's this accident. We have to do what we have to do. Time for grieving is later. Let's do that. And I know not everybody can do that. I went to an accident school out there where in Oak City, and the woman went into great detail about now. And I think I was the only woman in the class. We will have grief counselors. And you should take advantage. And she went on and on and on about this. And I finally got up and I said, ma'am, I am a woman of faith. And I think what happened was God's will, and we need to just take care of our human end of it and do it efficiently. But then I realized, Martha, there are people who aren't like you.
So on a happier topic, what is toilet paper cutting, and is it legal?
It's wonderful. Everybody should cut toilet paper. It's very legal. The law says the only thing you can't drop out of an airplane is something that would be a hazard to somebody on the ground. So, and the best airplane, of course, is a Cub, because you can put the door down and unravel up 3 or 4 feet and then bring it up just before a stall and throw that thing out. And it's not easy to do. Come around and you want to be careful of other traffic, but go out in the country and do it. And the neat thing is, the more cuts you get, those pieces of toilet paper stay on the nose of the airplane and on the wing. So when you get into the hangar and you put the tailwheel down, they all flutter to the ground.
So what's your best tip for a pilot checking out in a Cessna 180? We talked about it, not the easiest tailwheel airplane out there. You've got some experience. If I'm checking out, what's something I should remember?
I think the best thing to start out with is just plain old taxiing, on taxiways. But then I think it helps to initiate a takeoff and bring it up on the main gear, pull the power back, and stop and keep it straight. And do that until you're fairly, and where you learn where to look. You can't look in close. You got to look way out. And that's something I forgot. And I got back into it, and I thought, why am I landing so bad? You're looking in the wrong place. And then always, not only tailwheels, but on pattern work and landings, I always have people come around till they can fly a pretty decent pattern with airspeed control and coordinated turns, not cross-controlling, and then come down almost to the flare position, add the power, and fly it all the way down the runway. I think that's a really excellent. It relieves some of the ground shyness. And then the third really important thing is luck.
That never hurts in aviation, right?
That's right. That's right.
All right, Martha, our last question is always the same on this podcast. You have one final flight, and we want to know, what are you flying and where are you going?
Oh, okay. Oh, if I had one final flight. If I had one final flight, I'd take off from Lunken Airport and I'd visit all my friends in Indiana, Ohio, Northern Kentucky, and there, God knows there's plenty of airports. I'd visit all my friends and say goodbye.
Martha, thanks for being on the podcast.
Thank you for asking me.
Thanks Thanks for listening to Pilot's Discretion, brought to you by Sporties, training and equipping pilots worldwide for over 60 years. For more episodes and today's show links, visit sporties.com/podcast. I'm John Zimmerman. We'll see you next time on Pilot's Discretion.